Hi everyone, my name is Megan and I will be covering Chapter 1 from our Biology 2E Open Stax textbook. So if you haven't had a chance already, I recommend going to the Open Stax website, so www.openstax.org, and looking up the books. So the book we are working through today is, or the chapter we're working through today is from our Biology 2E Open Stax free textbook. So if you do visit the website, and the link is right down here for you, and I'll also put it in the notes, this website will give you full access to Chapter 1, as well as some additional stuff that may be helpful in your studies. So for example, they have a key terms list, so you can maybe make flashcards. They also have some access to extra questions, which we will be covering some of the multiple choice questions from the Open Stax website within this lecture. But there are also some critical thinking questions that I suggest maybe visiting at the end of this video to make sure that you're understanding the material completely as well as accurately. So if you, I will be continuing to post different chapters of the Open Stax textbook in the coming weeks. So I highly suggest that you click subscribe so that you don't miss any of those updates along the way. Okay. So let's take a look at Chapter 1. And just a reminder, I'm not affiliated with Open Stax. It's a free textbook, free website, and all of that. So all of these slides, a lot of the images from the slides I got directly from the Open Stax textbook, and I did cite them underneath so that you can see. Also, a lot of the pictures that you'll be seeing, figures that you'll be seeing, correspond to the figures directly out of the textbook. So this video will concentrate on the first part of Chapter 1. So Chapter 1 is the study of life, and it's divided into two segments. So we have the science of biology as well as the themes and concepts of biology. So I will just be covering section 1.1, the science of biology, in this video. Once you've watched this video, understood it, read the textbook, understood the questions associated with this section of the textbook, I highly recommend that you then move on to my second video, 1.2, which will cover the themes and concepts of biology section of our Open Stax textbook. So 1.1, the study of biology, covers the following learning objectives. So by the end of this video, you should be able to identify the shared characteristics of the natural sciences. You should be able to summarize the steps of the scientific method, compare the difference between inductive reasoning and deductive reasoning, and be able to identify the types, and then describe the goals of basic science and applied science. So let's start out with the question, well, what is biology? Well, the simple explanation, or basically the definition from the textbook, is that biology is the study of living organisms. And we don't just study the specific organisms, we learn about how they're interacting with each other, as well as other elements within the environment that they're in. So if you take a look at these pictures, you'll see the picture on the left is basically, it's these little blue-green cyanobacteria. So the reason why I want to point these out is that bacteria are some of the earliest known inhabitants of this planet, Earth. So we do think that the earliest forms of life inhabited the Earth approximately 3 billion years ago. So that's a long time ago. And these microbes, over long periods of time, billions of years inhabiting the ocean, thrived and evolved. And today we see surrounding us in our natural, environments, we see this diversity of life. So ranging from our big tall trees to, different animals, different fungi, all sorts of things inhabiting the earth surrounding us. But back 3 billion years ago, if we went back in time, we would basically see a different earth. So it was just basically our microorganisms that inhabited the earth. So those are the oldest forms of life. All right, so we're going to get into the process of science. So with the process of science, we are going to understand a little bit about what science is and what science can address and what topics science cannot address. So science is the knowledge that covers general truths or the operation of general laws, especially when acquired and tested by the scientific method. So there are a number of things out there in our world that we want to know more about. Some of those questions that we might have can be answered through science. Okay, some of those questions, the more philosophical ones, cannot be answered by science. So basically, in order for us to figure out, well, can science address it or not, is basically going through a process known as the scientific method. So the scientific method is a method of research with defined steps that include experiments and careful observations. So it's this process that we use in order to answer that question that we might have. Now, right off the bat, you might be thinking about questions that you're curious about. And some of those questions, again, can be answered through science. And one easy way to determine if it can be answered is if we can collect data on it. So, and that data is empirical, it's, something quantifiable or qualifiable, and so forth. So other questions that are more philosophical, like what's the meaning of life, or what is love, that cannot be answered through the scientific method. So that's more of a different realm of study, not a scientific one. Okay. So one thing that the scientific method addresses is basically we're trying to answer a question, and by answering a question, we will come up with our own ideas or an explanation of that that could answer that question. So those are called hypotheses. So a hypothesis is a suggested explanation for an event which we can test. So these are more narrow in scope. They have to be testable, and they also have to be falsifiable, meaning that if we collect evidence in the form of data, we can either accept our hypothesis or reject it based on that data that we've collected. This is different from a theory. So in science, scientific theories are like hypotheses that have been tested and explained and accepted over and over and over and over and over and over and over again. So a theory is tested and confirmed. So they're explanations for observations of phenomena. Since normally we don't sit there and test the same thing over and over and over again, these theories are more broad-based, okay? So an example of a theory you may be familiar with is something like germ theory, or the theory of gravity, okay? So, or cell theory, or the theory of evolution by means of natural selection. So those are all examples of scientific theories, meaning that they have been tested over and over and over again through varied experiences or experiments, and each time it confirms that these, things hold true. And so we're going to be focusing on some of these scientific theories through our textbook. Okay. A scientific theory is a lot different from our use of the term theory in our everyday vocabulary. So sometimes people say like, oh, I have a theory that it's gonna rain today. Well, that's actually a hypothesis, that's not a theory. So a theory, or I have a theory that J-Lo is going to have a happy long marriage. I don't know. So, that's more of a hypothesis. That is not a scientific theory. So theories are broad in scope. They have varied evidence to support them. Right now, you are proving or showing evidence that the theory of gravity exists, okay? Because you're not floating around in space. So theories are broader in scope. So think broad hypotheses in scope. Okay. Now, as far as our field of science, we're focusing in this course on natural sciences because, that's the more fun ones, in my opinion. So as far as this textbook, we cover biology, which is considered a natural science, specifically a life science. So natural sciences include fields of science related to the physical world and its phenomena and life processes. So, there's a diversity of scientific fields out there. So if you just look at this figure over here on the right, we see all sorts of different sciences applied. So we have astronomy, for example, biology. Computer science is also considered a field of science, though not a natural one. Okay, so that's more human-led. Geology is a natural science because we're looking at the layers of the earth and how the earth has changed over time and so forth. So these, some of these are considered natural, some of these are considered just regular types of science. And we can further take our natural sciences and divide them into two categories. So we have our life sciences, such as biology, and then the physical sciences, which would be more something like chemistry, geology, things like that. So when we are talking about our sciences, or specifically our natural sciences, we're restricted to natural explanations of phenomena. So these are not supernatural. We only express areas that can be explained through the laws of nature. Okay, so anything that's beyond that, such as magic or miracles or space aliens or even the existence of God, that is something that we cannot address in science, okay, because that goes beyond those natural laws. Okay, so we won't be focusing on any of those in this course. We'll be focusing more on the natural laws that we can explain through science. Another thing that we look at with science is a topic called scientific reasoning. So in scientific reasoning, we will take a question, we go to answer it with a hypothesis, and then we need to come up with evidence to support that. So we end up with some sort of conclusion at the end. And so the conclusion can be gained through two forms of reasoning. Usually we focus on, is it an inductive form of reasoning or is it a deductive form? So let's explore the two. Okay, so inductive reasoning is basically from a number of observations where we can come up with a general conclusion. So for example, here is something directly from your textbook. We are noticing around us that members of a species are not all the same. Okay, so for example, if you have some eastern gray squirrels moseying around in your backyard, they're all the same species, but they're not exactly alike. Okay, you might see distinct differences in them. And you also might notice that individuals of that species, of the eastern gray squirrel, they're competing for resources. They're competing for access to food, to nesting space. They might even fight with each other over a certain food source and so forth. And then we also notice that they seem to be doing well in their environment. They're generally adapted to their environment. The eastern gray squirrels that I see in my backyard, even though they're in where I am, they're a non-native species, they seem to be perfectly adapted to the environment. They have thick bushy tails that keep them warm during the cold nights here, that they can wrap themselves around. They're very agile. They can jump from limb to limb in the branches and so forth. So those are my observations. So based on all of those observations, I can conclude that individuals most adapted to their environment are most likely to survive and then pass their traits on to the next generation. So these eastern gray squirrels, they are existing today because they hold the genes that allow them to have the traits that make them perfectly well adapted to the environment that they're in. And they obtain those traits from previous generations. Okay, so their parents and their grandparents and their great-grandparents, they were able to survive and pass on those traits to their offspring. And so based on this, this process, this is an example of inductive reasoning, since I'm taking all of these number of observations and I'm coming up with a general conclusion. So members of these species are not all the same. Individuals compete for resources and species are generally adapted to their environment. So I can apply that to say that, well, the most adapted individuals are more likely to survive and pass on those traits to the next generation. So this is a form of inductive reasoning. Deductive is a little different. So in deductive, we go from taking a general premise and predicting specific results from it. So it's the opposite, whereas inductive reasoning, we're taking specific observations and then we're applying it to a broad category or conclusion. Whereas deductive reasonings, we're taking this broad idea and applying it to predict specific results. So here is an example. So our general premise is that individuals most adapted to their environment are more likely to survive and pass their traits on to the next generation. So based on that idea, that general premise, I might predict that if the average temperature of the ecosystem increases due to climate change, which we're noticing, that individuals within that area that are better adapted to warmer temperatures will outcompete those that are not. So you can see how we're taking something that we've already noticed and come up with a general premise that, you know, individuals most adapted to their environment are more likely to survive and pass them on. Well, if the environment is changing due to global climate change and it becomes warmer, then I predict, based on that information, that the individuals that are better adapted to the warmer temperatures will then survive better because they're going to be able to outcompete the individuals that are not adapted or better adapted to those warmer temperatures. Okay, so I'm going kind of from a broad to a more narrow predicted results. So those are the differences between inductive and deductive reasoning. So here is something that is in your textbook, and it basically gives us a question where we're going to take that figure from that textbook and apply it. Okay, so here's the figure again from your textbook. So the two types of reasoning I just showed you, inductive reasoning versus deductive. So you can use that to help you answer this question if you need to. So the question is, decide if each of the following is an example of inductive or deductive reasoning. Okay, so for the first one, it says all flying birds and insects have wings. Birds and insects flap their wings as they move through the air. Therefore, wings enable flight. So is this an example of inductive or deductive reasoning? Are we coming up with observations and presenting a conclusion based on those observations? Or are we starting out with a general premise and predicting results from that? What do you think? Well, if you thought this was inductive reasoning, I would agree with you, okay? Because we have some observations here. All flying birds and insects have wings. Birds and insects flap their wings as they move through the air. Therefore, based on those observations, I can come up with the conclusion that wings enable flight. Okay, so you can see how it's based on observations. Here's another one. Let's see if we can get this one right. Insects generally survive mild winters better than harsh ones. Therefore, insect pests will become more problematic if global temperatures increase. So do you think, is this an example of inductive reasoning or deductive? If you chose deductive, I would agree with you, okay? Because we're starting out with a general premise. Insects generally survive mild winters better than harsh ones. And so based on that general premise, we're coming up with some predicted results. Okay, so therefore insects will become more problematic if global temperature increases. So if something happens based on this general premise, I predict that this is going to become more problematic. Okay. Let's try number 3. So chromosomes, the carriers of DNA, are distributed evenly between the daughter cells during cell division. Therefore, each daughter cell will have the same chromosome set as the mother cell. So again, are we talking about observations or a general premise here? So chromosomes, the carriers of DNA, are distributed evenly between the daughter cells during cell division. Therefore, each daughter cell will have the same chromosome set as the mother cell. So what do you think? Is this a form of inductive reasoning or deductive? So this is an example of deductive reasoning because we're taking a general premise. In this case, we know that chromosomes, the carrier of DNA, are distributed evenly between the daughter cells during cell division. So we're coming up with predictive results. So based on this knowledge that, these DNA strands are condensed and part of a chromosome, they're going to be distributed evenly when the cell divides. So based on that knowledge, we can explain or predict that each daughter cell will have the same chromosome set as the mother cell. Okay. The final one, let's see if we get this one right. So far we've done inductive, deductive, deductive. What's this last one going to be? So number 4, animals as diverse as humans, insects, and wolves all exhibit social behavior. Therefore, social behavior must have an evolutionary advantage. So is this an example of inductive or deductive reasoning? If you chose inductive reasoning, I would agree with you. So we're starting out again with some sort of observation. So we have noticed around us that animals are diverse. The diversity of animals, including humans, insects, and wolves, all exhibit social behavior. So that's what we're observing. So based on those observations, we can conclude that social behavior must have some sort of evolutionary advantage. Okay? So based on this visual connection, do you think you can identify something that could be formed through inductive reasoning versus deductive? Okay, so think about that. If not, then maybe go back, read that section of the chapter, since it is a little confusing at first. All right. So moving on, now that we have an understanding of the process of science, let's focus in on how we collect data, how do we come up with results to accept or reject hypotheses. So this all falls under the scientific method. So what is the scientific method? The scientific method is a series of well-defined steps. So if we take a look over on the right-hand side, this is a figure from your textbook that shows the process, okay, the step-by-step process that we take. And one thing you'll notice about it, look at where the arrows are. So they actually keep going. So it's almost like once you've completed the scientific method, you haven't actually completed it. It sometimes just leads you to more questions. So we're going to start out by looking at that. So let's take a look at the top. It says make an observation. So typically when we're making an observation, we're using our senses, okay? So we might use our sense of sight and notice outside us that, all of the leaves are green. So that might trigger a question. Well, why are the leaves green? And so based on that question, we might come up with a hypothesis. So when we come up with a hypothesis, remember a hypothesis is a proposed explanation to your question. Okay, so why are the leaves green? I might come up with a hypothesis to explain why the leaves are green. Now, when we're creating a hypothesis in science, that hypothesis must be testable and it must be falsifiable. Okay, meaning that we can do some sort of experiment or observation to collect evidence, and that the evidence will either lead us to accepting or rejecting that hypothesis. There won't be a gray area, okay? So sometimes it's a little tough to make a hypothesis that follows these two criteria, that it's testable as well as being falsifiable, okay? Once we come up with a hypothesis, then we start developing an experimental design. So how are we going to test our hypothesis? So sometimes we just do observational studies where we just go out there and we observe and collect data that way. Sometimes we do more of an experimental case where we test our hypothesis through a series of events and collect data or evidence based on that. So if we're going to do the experimental route, we're going to have one or more variables and one or more controls. So what is a variable? Well, a variable is any part of the experiment that can vary or change during an experiment. Okay, so we have to think about that ahead of time. Now, in a controlled experiment, we want to make sure that we know the different variables and try to control for them, so that when we're conducting the experiment, we want to basically only change one of those variables, okay, so that all the others are the same, and that way we can pinpoint whether that data that we collect from that change will allow us to accept or reject our hypothesis. So for an example, let's say that I was trying to figure out what type of fertilizer will work best in growing my plants. And so in this case, I would want to control for all other variables. And the only thing I want to change is the type of fertilizer that I give to the plants. And so I might have different brands of fertilizer, but everything else within that experiment stays the same. Okay, so I might have the same type of soil, the same type of watering schedule, water them a certain time, the same species of plants, the same amount of light, they're housed in the same area so they get the same temperature and airflow and so forth. So I'm controlling all of the variables so they're all the same amongst the plants. The only thing I'm going to change though is that I'm going to give some plants one type of fertilizer, some plants a different type of fertilizer, and so forth. So I'm only changing the type of fertilizer. So that's an example of a controlled experiment. Okay. Usually, if I'm doing a controlled experiment, I will actually include a control group as well. Not always, but a control group is basically where you have a group within your experiment that is the same across all the other experimental groups, but the only difference is that they don't actually get the treatment. So in my example of the fertilizers, I might have some plants set aside within my experiment that don't get any fertilizer. And then that way I can tell right away if it's the fertilizer that's having an effect on the plants or if it's the specific brand of fertilizer. Okay, so if the group that's getting no fertilizer grows just as well as the ones that are getting different fertilizers, then I can't say for certain that it's the specific brand that's affecting them. Okay, so control groups are good to allow us to figure out, if the actual manipulation that we're doing is effective or not. Okay. So now that I've kind of developed my experimental design, I can go back into the scientific method and let's see, we've made let's say I'm using the same fertilizer example. I've made an observation that, plants with, they might be growing better in certain conditions. And so I might ask a question, well, I wonder if fertilizer will help them grow faster or better. And so I might formulate a hypothesis that answers that question. Fertilizer does have an effect on their growth. That would be a hypothesis that could be tested and falsified. And then I come up with a prediction. So a prediction is a little different from a hypothesis in the sense that it's predicting the results of your experiment. So if I apply fertilizer onto these plants, then they will grow taller than the ones that don't receive the fertilizer. So in this case, I'm actually predicting the results of the experiment. So that's the difference between a hypothesis and a prediction. Hypothesis is answering the question, and it's testable and falsifiable. A prediction is actually predicting the outcome of the experiment. Okay. Then I go ahead and test my experiment. I have my groups of plants, I have different fertilizers, everything is controlled for, and I'm collecting data along the way. So that data that I'm collecting will then allow me to answer whether or not my hypothesis should be accepted or rejected based on that data. Now, usually you get all sorts of data. You might measure the growth rate every, once a week for 4 months. And so you're collecting a lot of data. And so sometimes you have to step back and take a look at all of that data and analyze it. Okay, so that could be through simply graphing and seeing trends in your data, or maybe using some sort of statistical analysis or with ANOVA or something like that. But in the end, you're going to analyze your results, and you're going to look at the trends in data that you see. And you're going to decide, well, based on this data that I've collected and analyzed, am I going to accept my hypothesis or am I going to reject it? So if I accepted it, in this case, I will have supportive evidence to that. Okay, so my hypothesis being that fertilizer will have an effect on the growth rate of the plants. Well, if my data supports that, then I'd say, yeah, I'm accepting my hypothesis and I can report my results. If, let's say that the growth rate didn't change compared to the control group versus the group that received fertilizer, we got very similar data sets. Therefore we can't support our hypothesis. And so in that case, we might have to come up with a new hypothesis. Okay? So that's the scientific method with an example. So based on that information that we've, learned the process of the scientific method, let's do this visual connection question. So here is that same figure from your textbook, and we need to do some matching here. So you can see here that we have some steps of our scientific method, and then we have a number of statements here. So we need to figure out which one's the observation, question, hypothesis, prediction, experiment, and result. Okay? So let's take a look over here. So first things first, I gotta find the observation. Remember, an observation is using your senses to, notice something that's around you. So let's see. Would it be, there is something wrong with the outlet? No, because that's not really an observation yet. If there's something wrong within the outlet, my coffee maker also won't work. No, that's something a little more in depth. My toaster doesn't toast my bread. That looks like an observation to me. So I'm going with the idea that, yeah, for number one, I think it's C, but I don't know just yet. Okay, I'm pretty sure, that sounds like an observation to me. So now I gotta find the question. Well, that one's easy. It's the one with the question mark, right? Oh, it must be F down here. Well, why doesn't my toaster work? Then we're going to come up with a hypothesis. Remember, a hypothesis is a proposed explanation to your question. So my toast doesn't toast my bread. Why doesn't my toaster work? Well, I think maybe it might be that there's something wrong with the electrical outlet. Okay, so that would be an example of a hypothesis and a possible explanation to the question. And in this case, it is testable. Okay, we can find out if the electrical outlet is, something's wrong with it, and it's falsifiable. Okay, either it's the electrical outlet is working or it's not. Okay, so then we got to find the prediction. Now, a hint to predictions, a lot of times they're in an if-then format. So if I do this, then this will happen. Okay, so let's see if we can find something like that. Hey, look at B. If something is wrong within the outlet, my coffee maker also won't work if I plug it in. So if I take a different appliance, plug it in, and it still doesn't work, then it must be the electrical outlet. So that would be an example of a prediction. Then, what do? We experiment. Let's say that we plug in the coffee maker, and hey, it works. That's an example of an experiment. We've got evidence now. In this case, it rejected or didn't support my hypothesis that there's something wrong with the electrical outlet. So this might lead me to, it wasn't supported there, so maybe it wasn't the electrical outlet, maybe it's something else. Maybe it's just the toaster's broken or something else. So based on this visual connection question, let's make sure that everything makes sense. So I thought that, I'm going to do them in order now. So I thought the observation was C. So my toaster doesn't toast my bread. Why doesn't my toaster work? That's a question. There is something wrong with the electrical outlet. There's my hypothesis. If something is wrong within the outlet, my coffee maker also won't work if I plug it in. That's the prediction. I plug in my coffee maker into the outlet. I experiment. My coffee maker works. The result. Okay, so that makes sense now. All right. So towards the end of this section, we get into the types of science. So we've already talked about, different areas of science, such as natural sciences versus physical sciences and so forth. But we can also look at it from a broad versus more specific level. So basic versus applied science. So basic science is what we think of as pure science. So we're just seeking to expand the knowledge regardless of short-term application of that knowledge. So for example, I might want to go study eastern gray squirrels, and I just want to study it for understanding that particular species. So I might go and do research and observe and see how this population of eastern gray squirrels are nesting, where they're nesting, what time of year do they nest, are they nesting by themselves, are they nesting with other squirrels, are they related to each other if they're nesting with other squirrels, or are they just random strangers that they are just keeping warm with. So that's all examples of basic science. I'm just expanding the knowledge from what we previously knew about eastern gray squirrels. Applied science aims to use science to solve immediate problems. So for example, something like global climate change, that's a real problem that we're facing on a global scale. So applying our information that we've gathered, coming up with solutions. Well, what can we do about it? We know that we've gathered evidence to know that there's a lot more carbon in the atmosphere than in previous centuries to thousands and thousands of years ago. And so, well, we can apply what we know to help solve those immediate problems, okay? So we might, come up with ways to do that. So here's an example over here on the right. Here's a figure from your textbook of it. Oh, it's so cute, a little gray squirrel here. So it says here that after Hurricane Irma struck the Caribbean and Florida in 2017, thousands of baby squirrels like this were flown from their nests. So this might be an example of using applied science. So now we have this problem. These baby squirrels are being, they got blown out of their nests during this strong hurricane. And so we need to solve that problem. And so we might, take in those squirrels, rehabilitate them, and so forth. So this is an example of applied science. We're not just simply observing, what hurricanes do to squirrels. We're actually trying to solve the problem. These baby squirrels were blown out of their nests. How do we, make sure that they can survive? Okay. All right, and then finally, we get to our scientific method and science in general. Something that's a lot different in science compared to other fields of study is that science requires peer review. And so that means that if I am going to publish my results to a particular experiment in an academic scientific journal, it's going to be peer reviewed first before it gets published. Okay, so this isn't just, I'm putting in a blog onto the internet, my results, and, this is now accepted into the scientific field. Nope, it needs to be peer reviewed first. So what does that involve? So peer review is a process where other scientists in that same field will review that work, that piece of work, and they might actually conduct similar experiments to validate the same results that scientist found. And then they're basically using their own their own level of experiment or experience and knowledge and expertise in that field, and make sure that the scientist that wants to publish this piece of work is logical, that their results are verifiable, that it's valid. Okay, so that adds to the merit of that publication. Okay, we want to make sure that this is sound scientific reasoning, that this scientist that's proposing this article for publication has followed the steps of the scientific method, has tried to limit bias and things like that into their conclusions and so forth. So we do have this pretty lengthy process in order for some new scientific discovery to make it to publication. Okay, so it has to be verified through peer review. Okay, and then once it gets verified and submitted for publication, it will get distributed into an academic scientific journal. So these are considered primary literature. If you've ever looked into an academic scientific journal, it's pretty very specific, and it includes a lot of information that if you're not an expert in that field or work in that field, it might be a little more difficult for you to understand. So it's not created for just layman's terms. Usually when we do publish things in a scientific journal, they follow a certain format though, and that format always includes an abstract, so that's just kind of a summary of what that paper talks about, and then an introduction which gives background information to that whatever the topic is. It'll include a methods section, so it's stating exactly what that scientist did to collect the data, and then displays the results usually in a visual format as well as a written format, so that the reader can see exactly how the data was analyzed, and then what the trends in data that the scientists found. And then there's usually a discussion section that includes whether the scientists data that they collected supports or rejects their hypothesis, and kind of goes through what the trends in data show and why they show it, and maybe even anything that the scientists came across that maybe or weaknesses in his or her study and so forth. And then finally, there's a literature cited section. So this includes basically all of the references that scientists used in order to publish that paper. So where they may have gotten background information, where they may have found other scientists to compare their results with, and so forth. So it's pretty extensive. You'll notice those literature cited pages in the scientific journals, they're long. There's lots of citations in there. Okay, so it's a lot different than just, doing something on your own and then just putting it out there in the world, not peer reviewed. Okay, so your results may not be valid. Okay, so peer review helps validate those results. Okay, so for the rest of this lecture, I'm just going to go through some of the review questions that are available through Open Stax, and we'll answer them together. So the first question, the first forms of life on Earth, well, what were they? Were they plants, microorganisms? Were they birds? Or were they dinosaurs? What were the first forms of life on Earth? Remember 3 billion years ago? What existed? If you answered microorganisms, I would agree with you. So those microorganisms were the first. Here's another question. A suggested and testable explanation for an event is called, is it a hypothesis, a variable, a theory, or control? If you chose hypothesis, I would agree with you. So remember, a hypothesis is going to basically answer that question, but it also needs to be testable and falsifiable. Variables, those are just changes, that you see within the experiment. So anything that can change. A theory is broader in scope, so it's something that explains some sort of natural phenomena. And then a control is basically something that has the same exact, control, that word control can be based on a controlled variable, so that's something that we keep the same amongst all treatment groups, such as the same amount of light in our fertilizer study. So that would be a controlled variable. A controlled group would be something that doesn't receive the treatment. Okay, so there's a couple different definitions there, but none of them are the same as this definition up here. So the answer is a hypothesis. Here's another review question. Which of the following sciences is not considered a natural science? Would it be biology, astronomy, physics, or computer science? Well, does biology adjust natural laws? Mm-hmm. Astronomy? Mm-hmm. Physics? Yeah. I think of like the theory of thermodynamics, which we'll get into later on. That's a physics law, or the law of thermodynamics, first law. So yeah, that's a natural law. Computer science? No, because that's all human-made, right? Okay. So that's not considered natural. Next question. The type of logical thinking that uses related observations to arrive at a general conclusion is called, well, was that deductive reasoning? Is that the scientific method? Is that hypothesis-based science? Or is that inductive reasoning? If you chose inductive reasoning, I would agree with you, because we're taking a bunch of observations and then we're arriving to some sort of conclusion. So that's inductive reasoning. Deductive, remember, we already have this premise, and then we use that premise to predict further results. And then we have the process of blank helps to ensure that a scientist's research is original, significant, logical, and thorough. The process of publication, the process of public speaking, the process of peer review, or the process of the scientific method helps to ensure that a scientist's research is original, significant, logical, and thorough. Which one do you think it is? If you chose peer review, I would agree with you. So the process of peer review is helping to ensure that that scientist's research is original, is significant for publication, it's logical, and it's thorough. Okay, so that's an example of peer review. The scientist probably used the scientific method did use the scientific method in order to do that research. But yeah, the peer review process involves making sure that it was original and so forth. Okay. And then finally, we have this last question. So a person notices that her houseplants that are regularly exposed to music seem to grow more quickly than those in rooms with no music. As a result, she determines that plants grow better when exposed to music. This example most closely resembles which type of reasoning? Would that be inductive reasoning, deductive reasoning? Neither, because there's no hypothesis, or both? What do you think? A person notices that her houseplants are regularly exposed to music. Notices. That's an observation. So it's inductive. Okay, so the first one, inductive reasoning. So hopefully you have been able to identify the differences. All right, so that's it with our first section of chapter 1. So we've covered the science of biology. I will be further going into a new video for 1.2, which covers the other half of that chapter in chapter 1. So that covers themes and concepts of biology. Again, if you are enjoying this lecture series, go ahead and hit the subscribe button, and I'll see you again in 1.2.